Can you remember when we first realised our love for Ennio Morricone?
In sixth form, many years ago now, talking about the films we like and westerns and Sergio Leone, and an extension of that, we started talking about the music of Ennio Morricone. I think it was actually in the green room when we was like stayed after school and you were editing and we were both editing, and
I think we were working on our documentaries.
yeah.
And it's funny because we definitely, in the beginning, just loved his spaghetti western musical scores, but he did have so much more to offer. Ennio Morricone himself seemed like he was pretty frustrated a lot of the time that his most iconic music and the music that everyone really knew him for was his spaghetti western stuff. It's one of those things that happens with artists sometimes where a lot of the time their most beloved films or songs or whatever they do is the one they hate the most or never their favourite. You can kind of see why, I guess, because he came from like a classical side, didn't he? A lot of his spaghetti western stuff is super overproduced and lots of sound effects, and it should be corny, but somehow it's so fucking cool. And I wish I knew more about music to understand the complexity of his music. Like, if you play me Ecstasy of Gold or the main theme from The Good, the Bad and the Ugly with the fucking guitar comes in, just objectively my ears hear that and I get a good feeling. But I have no sense of how complex and how well written the music is underneath.
I'm not going to say I'm a musician of any sorts, but I did get to grade 3 of piano.
You can play EastEnders.
Yeah, basically many years ago. And I wasn't dedicated and I had to give up. But part of it was part and parcel like music theory. So you had to do music theory exams where you had to write out music and write, notes and stuff like that. When you saw him sitting down actually writing stuff out, I paused it just to look at the way he wrote stuff, and like I was just amazed by it because the skill to just write it that way, it took my breath away, to be honest.
Yeah, even knowing nothing about what it is to write music, it had that same feel as, when you see that weird genius who forgets to tie his shoelaces in his own home address, but spends all day on a chalkboard speed writing algorithms and figuring shit out on a level that we just couldn't possibly understand, but also that it nearly like pours out of them. When you get to a certain level of genius in anything, it always feels like there's nearly a muse or a higher power or entity or bigger intelligence nearly channeling people. Nikola Tesla, who, invented so many amazing things, got fucked up over in his life a bit. He had a bunch of inventions and technologies supposedly he, in theory, thought he could do that never happened because business-wise he got fucked over. But he used to talk about how his ideas would often come to him fully formed as if it was delivered by someone else. He would sleep on a problem and a completely new possibility or avenue to go down would be presented to him while he was sleeping or when he woke up. But it wasn't like he deduced something or worked out a solution. It was a thing he would never have thought of. Charles Darwin actually was big into channeling, and he actually felt that he got a lot of his theories about evolution directly through channeling and getting it from nearly another intelligence of some kind telepathically. And you see that with Ennio Morricone, because when he's writing music, he writes it ferociously. He goes at such a speed. It was nearly like it was pouring out of him. And you could see nearly a frustration of his hand can't move quick enough. It's like, how sometimes you have a raw thought and you try and express it and you're like, I'm already losing the thought before I can even begin to try and do it justice. My words are a blunt tool compared to this thing I have in my head that's just been presented to me. When he was doing The Mission, he'd actually decided he didn't want to do film scores anymore. When you're going to musically score a film, you watch it first in its finished form. And he watched it and he cried and he thought it was beautiful. And he was like, my music will ruin this film. I don't want to touch it. And he walked out and he was refusing to do it. But then he ended up calling the director a while later and being like, I have a couple of ideas, maybe this and that. What do you think? I'll do the film. And he said it was the most bizarre experience. Like, he really felt like he was given the music. It was nearly channeled through him. And he felt compelled to write it. He didn't want to write it, but he felt like he had no choice but to write it. And it was some other force or being was pressuring him and pushing him towards writing it.
Mordente, acciaccatura, mordenti.
And the music all came out in its pretty much final form immediately. He ended up realizing that all of the three main themes that were completely different from each other musically could be laid over each other and perfectly blend in with each other. And he said that had never happened in his whole career before or after. It was nearly like a religious experience because he was, a very religious guy. It's fascinating, that idea of, are you sometimes just a receiver of ideas?
I think he was, because a lot of the times, seemingly, he wouldn't even see the finished product. He'd just read the script and he'd be like, I've got an idea for this. And then when he went back to the director after reading the script, he'd present something which perfectly fitted the film. And it's like, how the fuck did you do that?
Yeah.
It does seem that there's something bigger in play here. It's like a lot of the geniuses had it. Leonardo da Vinci always said stuff would just come to him in dreams and then he'd end up like making these crazy inventions ahead of their time. And you say about him writing that speed, our boy Mozart, fucking, he used to just like sit down and write a whole opera in like an hour. Just like fucking like, if you just compare it to football terms, like when you're watching Messi, these people are just born like this way. Like there's no other way to describe it. It's just natural, God-given talent.
If you look out at the world, you can get people who are 3 foot tall, and some people are born 10 foot tall, and some people are, well, no one's born 10 foot tall, but people are born different heights, different shapes, different sizes, physically symmetrical and good looking, physically asymmetrical and not good looking, strong, big, weak, extra heads, extra bodies, albino, any range of possibilities. And every now and then, someone is going to be born with just the right combination of physical factors in their brain and their interests. And, maybe this part of the brain that understands music is a little bit enlarged, or there's better blood flow to it or something. And then they're born to a musician and they don't even want to do it, because Ennio Morricone originally, he wanted to be a doctor and his dad pressured him to become a musician, which is really weird because you always think of it being the other way around. He's pushed into that line of work, discovers that he has an immense, amazing talent for it, happens to be put under a brilliant teacher, and all those things align to produce, one of the best in the world. And you think of, I remember Arsene Wenger, the football manager, he used to say, it's so funny when you think about talent and opportunity and how important one is to the other. The best Formula One driver in history that there will ever be might have been born in the Congo, and we'll just never know it because he never got to get in a racing car. And Ennio Morricone, what if his dad hadn't been so pushy and he became a doctor? And he might have been a great doctor, but he in the world would never got to know the kind of beautiful music he could create and how influential he'd be on not just musical scores and classical music and composing, but even popular culture music and commercial music.
His dad wasn't like an amazing musician. They were just like trumpet players, and his dad made him go to play the trumpet. And even he himself, Morricone himself, admits he was shit at the trumpet. The instructors would be like, you're not very good. But then from there, he branched out to the composition sides. And then he went to this music school, and there was 2 composers there. There was Patrici and another guy. And Morricone watched Patrici live, composing, doing all this stuff. And he outright said, I'm not going to stay in this college unless I'm under Patrici. And he kept saying it. And from there, they kind of bonded. Even so that when he left, Patrici, like, they both burst out crying. And even in the interview, Morricone gets quite emotional about it. And he says, I'll get you a job.
You can see the relationship he ended up having with Patrici and his relationship with his dad, and how that dictated how he felt about his career and things he did during his career. You can kind of put the whole puzzle together of how he viewed things and why he viewed things the way he did. Even early on, you see him talking about when he was a kid during World War II, he would go and play trumpet for the soldiers, trying to earn a bit of money or get a bit of food or whatever, just, trying to get a bit of extra. Obviously, it was World War II, it was rationing, all that. And he describes it as a humiliation, specifically just having to play the trumpet to try and earn a living or try and earn food. It's interesting, you think a guy that would go on to make his entire career and living and a fortune from music. And he talked about how that made him hate the trumpet. His father, this overbearing figure who was the reason he even got into music. Later in his life, as his dad's ability to play the trumpet waned and he was no good anymore, he would never compose using trumpets until his father's dying day, because he didn't want to insult him with the idea that he would go to his friends or colleagues who were better trumpeters at the time. And also the fact that although Patrici taught him so much and influenced him, he was a real traditionalist. And Ennio Morricone, even from the get-go, from the young age, had an experimental side which he hid initially and then came out in his work, when he started writing compositions for the famous musicians of the day and the singers and what would have been back then pop stars, I guess. and then eventually doing films and cinema. The world loved it, but Morricone didn't seem to give a fuck what the world thought. He gave a fuck what his idol thought, and Patrizi hated it. And you can see that guilt Morricone carried for pretty much the rest of his life. Like, I got the impression he had major imposter syndrome for pretty much the majority of his entire life while he was a composer. He seemed to feel this terrible guilt about making music for film. You know, Patrizi would show up in his film concerts that he would do when he was going on tour and sit in the front row, and you could see that probably made him feel like shit.
Ennio himself, he's just sitting there in like a little chair, and he was like, "No, I'm not melodic. I'm no good at melody." And then it would cut to a famous Italian musician. I didn't know who they was, but they're probably big in Italy. He'd be like, "What?" he said that. Like, the man is a genius with melody.
It's like Leone saying, "Oh, I can't stand gunfights. Shootouts are boring."
I don't know, and I didn't really like this because it made me upset. Like, loving Ennio Morricone, I got a sense that he felt composing for film was not the best that you could do. I think he saw like opera up there and like film down there, and he felt a bit. It felt to me like he felt ashamed of working on films.
Felt like he was living his life as a prostitute.
Yeah.
It's such a shame because you could see, you know, he wasn't a guy that sought fame at all. People described him as timid, and it did sound like at times he was pushed around a lot. Sound like he would be bullied. You know, he could be very passionate about, you know, directors that worked with him would describe a lot of fights, a lot of arguments. This is not what I want to do musically. So he'd just walk out and abandon the film, and they'd run after him, beg him to stay and say, "Okay, do it your way." There are a lot of stories like that, but then also a lot of stories where getting pushed around. Like, it felt like Leone pushed him around quite a bit, and some of the stuff I absolutely love the most from Morricone is his arguably overproduced spaghetti western scores. But then you hear he was kind of like, he didn't want to necessarily always do a lot of the stuff that you associate so much with it, like the whistles and the sort of sound effects. And it's funny, I didn't even really register those as sound effects. But then again, how much is that even true? You know, he might be saying that because that's coming from a sense of guilt. One of the most influential and amazing and unique things about Morricone, especially for those times, was the fact that anything was an instrument. You didn't need lyrics. You could just have a person's vocal range became an instrument. Operatic singer, their vocal cords became an instrument. The chimes of a can became an instrument. He could throw a bunch of pans down the stairs and that would become an instrument. He was working on a level that was just amazing, but there was also, I guess, a trashy side to him that I love, but was a big stick that the traditionalists could beat him with.
I like the evolution of seeing how he got like the coyote noises in the Sergio Leone stuff. Like, there was one bit where he was doing something near the water's edge and on like a harbour, and then apparently like he just said, "I'm gonna use the sound of like water gushing into this pot," and he like spent ages doing that. And like, it's like famous singers at the time like, "What is this guy doing? I don't understand." And then obviously the finished product, they were like, "Fucking hell, like, how has he made water going into a pot into this?" And it's just like, and that for me shows the genius of him, because he hadn't thought of that before. He had just gone to the location of it, heard the water crashing, and was like, "You know what, I'm gonna make something of it." And like, to think on the fly like that and to make stuff, it shows how much of a genius he actually was. Like,
and later in life, like, he was a guy that constantly changed, constantly experimented with new ideas, new ways of doing things. I didn't realize until I really got into his history of the documentary and like researching for this, how much he's esteemed as really influencing music in general, influencing pop music, influencing how producers and studios and artists would approach how they thought about the background music. It didn't just become accompanying, it became as important to the song. Like, you look at the music he did, and then later in life, the music he did for films, it's not complementing the scene. Sometimes it's giving it the majority of its personality and actually colouring how you feel about the scene in a whole way. You'll watch a car chase or a standoff, and if you took the music out or had not as powerful music, what you're watching is pretty unremarkable, and also sometimes way too long. You know, moments can be stretched out. Really, that in real time would maybe take 10 seconds, but they're stretched out over minutes, and it only makes poetic and emotional sense because of the beautiful music. And it's nearly like the music takes center stage in his films at points. You know, we talked about Leone bullied him to an extent at points in his career. But if you watch the transgression of their movies together, Fistful of Dollars, they meet, they work together, it works beautifully. He records all the music afterwards. Leone tried to use a different piece of music from Rio Bravo for the final gunfight scene, and he's like, you're not doing that in my film, you can't use that for the biggest scene, like, let me write you something. And then he says, all right, write me something similar. And then in their second film, he writes a piece of music that encompasses the chimes of a watch. So for the first time, something to do with the story and the plot in the movie is influencing the music. For the third film and fourth film they worked together with, The Good, Bad and the Ugly and Once Upon a Time in the West, he actually starts writing music that would be used on set. So he'd write the music before it. And then with Once Upon a Time in America, he would literally write the music years before filming would take place and be writing the music as Leone was writing the story and creating the vision of what he wanted the film to be in his mind. And oftentimes the music itself was actually influencing how he would be writing the scene and envisioning the scene. So it got to a point where I don't even think you can really say it was a Leone film. Like, it should have been a Leone and Morricone film, because the two were combining, and the music was more and more taking over the heavy lifting and the actual creation of the film. It wasn't becoming a thing that was written afterwards. It was literally becoming a thing that was influencing the final film from conception.
Yeah, I totally see that, because Leone was a master of using sounds to build up tension, to build up the scene. Like, if you looked at Once Upon a Time in the West and some of those scenes, like, some of those scenes are fucking 10 minutes long. Imagine watching that without the music, because if you look at it, there's only about 5 words of dialogue in some of these scenes, and like, without the music, it just wouldn't work at all. It's just like, I'm racking my brains here. Has there been a director composer partnership on this level again, or Ridley Scott's Hans Zimmer? Possibly.
Now,
Christopher Nolan.
Be interested to know how much they write, because maybe it is more common nowadays to write before it. But to the extent it got to where Leone would literally go back to the screenwriters and approach the scene in a different way, or think about what we want to focus on and how we want to tell the story based on the music Morricone was writing. You know, when you think of it in terms of that, I don't think there's ever been anything as much of a partnership of what it became, and how his music, you know, there's certain times where you can only, you know, you can't not associate a certain piece of music with a film and why it made so great. You know, John Williams' score, you know, when it becomes in booming as Dr. Grant first sees the dinosaur for the first time, that visual's so big, and part of the reason that moment is so amazing and jaw-dropping for the viewer is the music. But Morricone's music, it got so entangled with the filmmaking. There's nothing else compares. Like, its influence it had over it right from conception I've never seen it before and since. The only thing you could compare it to is the fact that Tarantino, you know, he'd watch Navajo from back in the day, or other, you know, Morricone beautiful pieces of music used in films, and he'd be like, I want to use that for this scene. So I guess that's similar in the sense, because he's thinking, I'm going to write a scene to that, and that's the piece of music that's going to go in, to the point where he would literally write into the script that actors would get, and, you know, his producers at Miramax would get, where it would say, this plays over this scene, and he would let you know when that music cuts off, or if it cuts off, or when it blends in, or if it hits the crescendo, it happens just as this is happening. So I guess that's a similar thing, but it's not the same as hearing a song like, I like that, I'll put it over my little short film I'm making. That's essentially the same thing. It's not the same as, you know, the composer saying, listen to these notes, or this is the idea I'm going to go for this character's main theme music. Hearing it, and then going back to the drawing board of how you're writing, having that dialogue with the person composing the music.
The only thing I can sort of compare it to, and it's nowhere near as big as the work that went into Leone and Morricone's film, is Spielberg with Jaws. The shark theme. When we heard that as the audience member, we knew that Bruce was coming. Do you know what I mean? So when you hear that, it has that impact on you. You're like, shit, the shark.
Yeah.
The shark is about. It's somewhere. It's gonna come. But again, nothing compared to that, because, as you said, the scenes were built around the music. Like I don't think I've ever seen anything like it again, or we may never see it again. That's the impact that it has. Like,
and it's funny because you take an actor like De Niro, who, you know, he was the face of the 70s era of authentic cinema that started coming out, where it was very grounded and method acting and realism. And to then take him and put him into scenes where he's going to have to dub in over his dialogue later, and the final music that will play in the scene is booming on set as they're recording takes. But he loved it. He said it was a different kind of action. It was a totally different approach, and he obviously had a lot of respect and would adhere to whatever Leone wanted to do because he loved him. But he also said he really got into that style of acting, and the fact that hearing the music would transport them directly to the emotion that the music was kind of trying to convey, so that it would actually end up, they would complement each other. It wasn't like, I'm going to act this way and then let's slap music on top, and, you know, he's going for something sad and this is going for something sad, so it kind of works. They informed each other the same way that, you know, Leone and Morricone were informing each other.
Yeah, I saw raw footage of that, and I thought it was like dubbed over. I didn't realise until I saw this documentary that it was actually playing on set, and like you don't really see a lot of it. You just see a couple of takes or whatever, but it was just mesmerising, like to see that kind of thought process from Leone to do that, to see De Niro just on set for like a film fan. It was just really like life affirming for me. Like I was quite like when I saw some of the scenes in Once Upon a Time in America, and I saw the music on the set, but it made me quite emotional, if I'm honest with you.
It also kind of because, you know, when you think of, we've talked about before, where actors, they love a costume, they love a practical effect, they love a set. They want something to get him into that mindset. And you can see that even in normal life, because it's like, how do you feel when you put on jogging bottoms?
Like, nice. Yeah.
You feel like a jogging bottom kind of guy who's going to do jogging bottom shit.
Yeah,
do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
if you put on a suit, you're suddenly like, oh, I feel like fucking,
exactly.
I feel like a bit of a don here, or I feel ready to go. And you can see why, you know, if they're saying, hey, you're a caveman, act like a caveman. If you put them in caveman rags and do their hair up like caveman and they can see themselves in the mirror, you're going to be able to get into that more. If you're supposed to be reacting to a giant monster, if you have a giant animatronic monster as opposed to a big green screen, you know, it's easier to get into it.
Yeah, 100%.
But I've never really thought about the fact of the music. And it's interesting for them. I wonder what it was like for actors to hear this beautiful piece of music that was created. It's not like they're going back in time like, you know, Kubrick on 2001 and pulling up all these hundreds of years old classic pieces of music. This piece of music has not just only been created for this film, but just been created for your character. You know, a lot of the time it'd be called Deborah's theme, Jill's theme. It wasn't Once Upon a Time in the West, the sad song. It was about your character. And hearing that and getting those emotions stirred up that it stirs up, that must be great fucking rocket fuel for getting into your character and getting into the scene. And it's the same way when you use music to motivate you to work out or exercise or get you pumped up for something, or just get you ready to go out and get in the mood for going out. That must be a great tool for getting actors into their characters and into the scene.
But imagine it back in the day on Once Upon a Time in America. You're De Niro at that time period, the top actor on earth.
It was in his pomp.
Yeah.
Big time.
And literally, you get a call from Leone. Like, that's big enough as in itself to be like, I'll come and work for you. But it's like, Morricone's going to be on this, and you're going to have your own theme. Bang, I'm on that.
Yeah.
Like, put me on that set right now. Like, I would have fucking, even they were saying like,
What do you reckon Phil's theme would sound like?
oh, just a bunch of gibberish and rubbish.
And then the sound of someone falling over and glass breaking, and then it ends.
But it's like even like the director of The Mission was saying like, that whole thing you said earlier of, I'm not going to do it. But then he calls him up and he's like, I've got an idea. And like down the phone is like, bum, 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 bum. Like just down the phone he's like, come and meet me. And the director of The Mission was saying, I went to this meeting. I was almost like fainting with excitement to go and meet the man. Like, imagine it, like, fucking hell, like.
And I could see that because you'd be so excited. You're getting a new Ennio Morricone score. He's doing your film. But then also, people associate, especially us, him with a very specific sound. But he constantly changed. Like, most of his famous spaghetti western things came from a specific period, which makes sense because spaghetti westerns were made during a certain period of time. But that also means that his sound did not stay like that. It changed constantly. And his westerns that he did later, like when he finally worked with Tarantino, had a completely different sound. And he actually said to Tarantino when he asked him, because he was, he's begging him for years to score one of my films. And he finally did it. But when he went up to him about it, he asked, like, why do you want me to do a score? Because do you want spaghetti western stuff? Like, I see you love that old stuff I did and that specific sound. You love to use it in all your films. I might want to make that when I come to compose, but I might make something completely different. So if that's really what you want, then just take some old music I did or do something else or find someone else. And he was like, no, just like whatever you do, I will love it. Like, just do whatever you want. And when you hear his score for Hateful Eight, it's instantly recognizable from the first couple of notes that it's a Ennio Morricone score. But at the same time, it's so different. It's got a whole different personality and flavor and approach and style to anything he did from the classic spaghetti western era.
The score perfectly does fit it because it's a very, the whole film's built on tension. And it's that whole, like, it starts with the, like, I don't know if it's a cello or violin and, like, those strings, like, I'd have liked to see Tarantino make a kind of Leone-esque kind of... I know he wouldn't do it because he's like, I'm not even going to attempt to try and do... But I'd like to have seen him try and do, like... I'm not going to compare it to Django, but that kind of film and see what Morricone came up with. I would like to have seen that because...
What a more conventional spaghetti
Yeah, because I do like The Hateful Eight, but the score of it was built on tension. I would have liked to have seen what Morricone would have came up with that kind of reflection.
See, I love The Hateful Eight because it is a spaghetti western. First of all, like in terms of setting, it's obviously a send up to The Great Silence by Sergio Corbucci, who Morricone would have scored a lot of. But also, it kind of is a bit of The Thing, isolated by blizzard, all trapped in one location, and no one can trust each other or know who is siding with each other or who's the villains. And which obviously Morricone also scored. But you know what's funny about Morricone as well is he can use such an array of instruments, such an array of styles of music. You shouldn't be able to recognise it, but you kind of always can recognise a Morricone tune, or you can definitely recognise when someone's homaging or trying to emulate the style of him. There's something about his music where even when it's a complex piece or a simple piece, it really tells a story. It's not just like nice music that goes well together and creates a feeling in you. There's like a weird texture and colour and detail to it and personality to it. Like there's something about the score for his spaghetti westerns that perfectly conveys what the genre is meant to be. The charm of it, the wink and a nod of it, the personality and the way it's entertaining and what it's trying to do. And it's the same way with his other scores. There's something about him, like it goes beyond, like John Williams creates beautiful pieces of music and he can hit the notes he wants to hit in terms of if it's supposed to be solemn and sad, it's beautiful and you really get that emotion. If it's supposed to feel like, Superman's flying up into space and it's that triumphant bit, you get that, it might send a shiver down your spine. But Leone has this sense of detail and texture and weird charm to his music. And every piece of music has its own individual personality. And I do feel like it stirs up more complex emotions in you than just the simple feeling good, feeling sad, feeling motivated, feeling awe-inspired. Do you know what I mean? There's something about his music. It's more complex. Like, it does something to you.
Ennio è riuscito a fondere insieme la prosa e la poesia.
You know, earlier we was talking about composer-filmmaker
Yeah.
relationships. You saying all that stuff about John Williams. Could we put Spielberg and Williams in this category?
Do you know what?
I just
like, the
thought
thing
of it
is,
now.
in terms of like unbelievable partnerships, absolutely. But we'd have to know and look into it to see, does he say, hey, I've got this idea for a movie, and then John Williams starts composing it? We'd have to look and see if it goes that deep.
The thing is that I think it might on one film, Schindler's List.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Because, you know, the subject matter of Schindler's List, Spielberg approached John Williams, and John Williams, much like Morricone on the Mission, he was like, I don't think I can write music for this. It's you know, it's something, the subject matter of I have no experience of, and I don't want to broach, but it's like, please write the music. So maybe we can compare it to that. But
Do you know what, as well, we always give credit to Spielberg saying he made Schindler's List and Jurassic Park in the same year. How amazing that.
Wow.
John Williams scored them both.
yeah,
Fucking hell.
Imagine that. You're writing something about the wonder of fucking dinosaurs, and then you're writing something so down about the horrors of the Holocaust, and it must fucking like burn you out. Because like, I've spoken to therapists who are like, I have to have breaks and see a therapist myself because of the stuff I deal with. It must be like hard in a human context.
Saying that though, I just thought as well, the way we talked about the way Morricone he devalued what he was doing for most of his life. But do you think that was nearly a blessing in some ways? Like Daniel Day-Lewis, he's the best actor in the world, a lot of people believe. And he's so precious about his roles. And partly it's probably maybe he needs something amazing or that speaks to him in order to get motivated to go do one. But maybe it's because he's worried about ever having a bad film. Because, you know, he only does a film every couple of years. I can't remember the last time he even did one now. And you see certain people like that where I feel like some people have legacy disease where they're worried about, I can't make a bad film. But sometimes, like M. Night Shyamalan's a bad example because he makes some awful films. But I do appreciate the fact that he's always willing to risk making a bad film because he might make a really good one. Do you know what I mean? But the fact that Morricone saw what he was doing as popcorn horseshit, even though he must have loved creating it, and you know, he must have loved it on some level, but he probably felt guilty and like, I'm making shite for movies. But did that help him in the fact that he didn't seem very choosy? I think in 1969 he scored the music for 21 different films, and they were all amazing. But the fact that he had the reins to not worry necessarily if he was gonna make music for a good film or make good music, where he could just unleash all his creativity and not worry about it.